She was auctioned off while she was still bleeding from giving birth. The Texas sun beat down on Calico Ridge like a hammer on an anvil, forging the dust and sweat into a thick, gritty haze. In the center of the town square, on a makeshift stage, knelt a girl. Her name was Isa, but no one had bothered to ask. The dress she wore was more rag than fabric, torn and stained with the rust-colored evidence of the life she'd just brought into the world. In her arms, a newborn whimpered, a tiny red-faced bundle of misery. Around her ankle, a thick iron chain, bolted to a post, had rubbed her skin raw. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. She just pressed her lips to the baby's head, her only act of defiance in a world that had tried to break her. The auctioneer, a man with a grin as wide as a snake's yawn, bellowed to the crowd, "Step right up, folks. A 2-for-1 special, young enough to work the fields, and comes with a squealer to grow your legacy." Laughter rippled through the grimy crowd of cattlemen and drifters. Someone shouted, "She's still bleeding!" The auctioneer just chuckled. "Fresh as a spring calf, starting at $50, $50 for the girl and the brat." The bids started flying. 75, 100, 150 from a man with a toothpick jutting from his teeth. Each shout was like a nail being driven into Isa's coffin. 200, 250. Her world was shrinking, the noise fading into a dull roar. Then a voice cut through the clamor. It was calm, but hard as granite. $300. The entire square went silent. Every head turned. At the edge of the crowd stood a man, tall and unmoving. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but you could see his jaw was clenched tight. He wore a faded duster and scuffed boots. He looked like nobody special, until you saw his eyes. They were like chips of ice. $300, he repeated, his voice louder this time, leaving no room for argument. The auctioneer stammered, "Sir, that's a steep price for—" "I know what I'm paying for," the man cut in. Someone from the crowd yelled, "What's your intent with the merchandise?" The stranger stepped forward, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a heavy final sound. He walked right up to the stage, his gaze never leaving Isa. "My intent?" he said, his voice dropping low, yet carrying across the entire square. "To give her a bed, and let her sleep." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. "A hell of a price for charity," someone muttered. The stranger didn't even turn. He just rested his hand on the revolver at his hip, a simple, quiet gesture that screamed danger. "Anyone want to top it?" he asked the silent crowd. No one moved. No one breathed. "Then shut your mouth and ring the bell." The auctioneer, sweating now, slammed his gavel down. "Sold!" The man, this stranger, climbed the stage. He didn't offer a hand. He pulled a knife, and with a single sharp flick of his wrist, he cut the leather tether binding the chain to the post. The iron shackle dropped from her ankle with a heavy clank. She stared at the raw, bloody circle on her skin, then up at him. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Sleep," he said. "Then we talk." He nodded toward the edge of town. "My name's Jack." She looked at him, at the quiet resolve in his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she saw something other than greed or cruelty. She forced her trembling legs to stand, clutching the baby to her chest. With the entire town watching, the stranger named Jack placed a hand lightly on her back and guided her away from the block, away from the chains, away from the life that was almost hers. They walked out of Calico Ridge, a girl, a baby, and a man who paid a fortune for a simple night's sleep. But Isa knew, deep in her bones, that nothing was ever that simple, and she wondered what kind of price she would really have to pay. The road to Jack's ranch was long and quiet. He didn't speak, and Isa didn't ask. She just walked, her bare feet aching, her mind racing. What kind of man does this? What does he truly want? Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every rustle in the grass a new danger. Finally they arrived. It wasn't much, a small weathered house, a barn, and a few corrals. But behind the main house, there was a small, separate cabin. One room, a stove, a cot, and a freshly made cradle. "This is yours," Jack said, his voice flat. He opened the door and stepped aside. Isa entered slowly, cautiously. The cot had clean sheets. A bowl of oatmeal sat on a small table. He'd thought of everything. Too much. He set a kettle on the stove. "I'll be back in the morning," he said, turning to leave. "You need rest. The child needs a mother who isn't half dead." He started to close the door behind him. "Wait." Issa's voice was barely a whisper. He paused. She laid the baby in the cradle, her back still to him. Her hand slid under the infant's thin blanket, and when it emerged, it was holding a small, wicked-looking knife she'd kept hidden. "If you try to touch me," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "I will kill you in your sleep." Jack stood in the doorway for a long moment. Issa expected him to be angry, to laugh, to take the knife. He did none of those things. He just nodded. "Fair enough," he said. And then he closed the door, leaving her in the quiet darkness. The night was long. Issa didn't sleep. She sat on the cot, knife in her hand, listening for footsteps, for the turn of a lock, for any sign of betrayal. But all she heard was the wind and the soft breathing of her baby. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, she saw something on the edge of the cradle that hadn't been there before. A small square of white fabric, a handkerchief embroidered with tiny bluebirds. It was old, worn, but clean. A gift. She was still staring at it when a soft knock came at the door. Jack entered, holding a bottle of warm milk. He saw her holding the knife, saw the look in her eyes, and he stopped. He set the milk on the table, far from her reach. "My mother made that," he said, nodding toward the handkerchief. "For my baby sister. She died before she ever got to use it." Issa stared at him, confused. Why was he telling her this? "Why give it to me?" "Because every child deserves something beautiful," he said simply. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond his stony expression. It looked like pain. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle of clean baby clothes. He set them next to the milk. "I'll be back at dusk," he said, and left. This time, as the door clicked shut, Issa felt a sliver of the tension in her shoulders release. She looked at the sleeping baby, at the clean clothes, at the embroidered birds. She still didn't trust him. Not yet. But as she finally lay down on the cot, she allowed her eyes to close, just for a moment. And in that moment, the darkness felt a little less like an enemy. She knew this quiet wouldn't last. A man like Jack, a man with sad eyes and a fast knife, didn't buy a girl at auction out of the goodness of his heart. He was looking for something, and she had a terrible feeling that he was going to find it in her. The days that followed were a strange kind of purgatory, quiet but filled with a humming tension. Jack kept his distance. Every morning, food would appear on her doorstep. Warm bread, fresh milk, sometimes an apple. He never tried to speak to her beyond a simple "mornin'." Issa spent her time in the cabin, caring for the baby she had started to call Samuel in the privacy of her own mind. She watched Jack from the window as he worked the ranch. He was strong, capable, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of years of hard labor. But there was something else about him. The way he watched the horizon, the way his hand always rested near his gun, even when he was mending a fence. He was a man expecting a storm. One afternoon, driven by a need for something, anything to do, Issa was washing Samuel's clothes in a bucket by the cabin. Jack approached, leading his horse. He stopped a few feet away. "Morning, Miss Isa," he said. She froze. Miss Isa. No one had ever called her that. It was always girl, or wench, or worse. "What did you call me?" she asked, her voice tight. He looked surprised. "Your name. I figured you had one." "No one's ever said it like that," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Jack just shrugged, a strange look on his face. "Seems wrong," he said, and led his horse to the barn. The small courtesy unsettled her more than a threat would have. It was a crack in the wall she had built around herself. That night the storm arrived. Not rain, but riders. 4 of them, their horses churning up dust as they stopped at the ranch gate. Issa's blood ran cold. She recognized one of them from the auction. The man with the toothpick, the one who'd bid $150. She grabbed Samuel and flattened herself against the cabin wall, her heart pounding against her ribs. Jack stepped out of the main house, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. He looked as calm as if he were greeting neighbors. "This is private land," Jack said, his voice deceptively mild. The lead rider, A man with yellow teeth and cruel eyes spat on the ground. We ain't here for your land, Morale. We're here for what's ours. He gestured with his chin toward the cabin. Stolen property. Took off before her paperwork cleared the flesh warrant registry. I paid for her, Jack said, his voice hardening. Fair and square. The man laughed, a nasty grating sound. You paid a crooked auctioneer. The real owner wants his investment back, or we take it out of your hide. Jack took a slow step forward, the shotgun now looking a lot less casual. On this ranch, he said, his voice dropping to a low growl, property doesn't breathe. That girl has a name. The rider's hand drifted toward his pistol. You making this a legal matter, Morale? 'Cause I got papers that say she belongs to my employer. I'm making it a human matter, Jack replied. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The air crackled. Issa held her breath, convinced she was about to see him die for her. Then, inexplicably, the lead rider shook his head. Ain't worth the trouble, he snarled. He yanked his reins and wheeled his horse around. But my boss ain't as reasonable as I am. He'll be back, and he'll collect. The other three followed, leaving a cloud of dust and a string of threats hanging in the air. Jack stood there until they were long gone, the shotgun still ready. Issa slowly stepped out of the cabin. Samuel clutched in her arms. You could have been killed, she whispered. So could you, he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. What if they come back? They will, he said, finally looking at her. And in his eyes she saw it again. Not pity, something harder, something that looked a lot like a hunt. Who is their boss? She asked. Jack's jaw tightened. A man who thinks he can own people. A man I've been looking for 5 years. And just like that, the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't about her. It had never been about her. She wasn't a rescue. She was bait. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Bait. He hadn't bought her to save her. He'd bought her to use her. The kindness, the food, the cabin. It was all just a way to keep his lure fresh. A cold, bitter rage washed over her, so potent it almost choked her. All her life, she'd been a thing, a piece of property to be used, sold, and discarded. She thought for a fleeting moment that Jack was different. She had been a fool. The trust she had tentatively started to build crumbled into dust. He wasn't her savior. He was just another man with a plan, and she was a pawn in his game. That night she didn't sleep. She sat by the window watching the main house. The light was on. What was he doing? Planning? Waiting? The knife felt cold and useless in her hand. What good was it against a man who had planned this all along? The next morning he came to her door as usual, a tray with bread and milk in his hands. She flung the door open before he could knock. You're using me, she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. You bought me so they would come here, so you could find this man you're looking for. Jack didn't deny it. He just looked at her, his face a mask of stone. He set the tray down. Yes, he said. The simple admission was more devastating than any lie. My sister, he said, his voice low and strained. Her name was Laura. She was taken 5 years ago, sold at an auction just like that one. Run by the same man. I've been tracking him ever since. I heard whispers that one of his girls had escaped with a child. I went to Calico Ridge, hoping it was her. He looked past her, into the cabin, at Samuel sleeping in the cradle. I see now that it wasn't. The story was meant to soften her, to make her understand. But all Issa heard was that she was a replacement, a stand-in for the person he really wanted to find. So what now? She spat. Now that your bait isn't the right kind, are you going to sell me back? No, he said, and for the first time his composure cracked. A flash of raw anguish crossed his face. No, I'm going to end this. For Laura. And for you. He reached into his duster and pulled out something that glinted in the morning light. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age. He opened it. Inside was a tiny faded portrait of a young woman with kind eyes. Jack's eyes. He held it out to her. This was hers, he said. It's all I have left of her. Issa stared at the locket. Her breath caught in her throat. The world tilted on its axis. She had seen that locket before. She knew those eyes. They weren't just Jack's eyes. They were Samuel's eyes. The girl who had died in her arms, the girl whose baby she had sworn to protect, wasn't just some anonymous victim. It was Laura, Jack's sister, and the baby he thought was a stranger's. The baby he was using as part of his revenge plot was his own blood, his nephew. She opened her mouth to tell him, to scream the truth at him, but then a new terrifying thought slammed into her. If she told him, what would he do? Would he take the baby? Would he cast her aside, her purpose served? She was the only mother Samuel had ever known. If she told Jack the truth, she could lose everything. And in that moment, she made a choice. She looked at the locket, then back at Jack's desperate, searching face, and she lied. "I've never seen it before," she said. The lie sat like a stone in her gut. Every time Jack looked at Samuel, every time he softened for a fraction of a second while watching the baby sleep, the guilt gnawed at her. But so did the fear. She had protected this child through hell itself, and she wouldn't give him up now, not even to his family. She told herself it was to protect Samuel, but a darker, more selfish truth echoed in her heart. She didn't want to be alone again, so she kept her silence, and the quiet ranch became a prison of secrets. Jack grew more restless, his patrols around the property more frequent. He was preparing for a war, and Issa was his unwilling soldier. He tried to teach her to shoot a rifle. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold it steady. "You need to learn to protect yourself," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I can't be everywhere at once." "I've protected myself this far," she retorted, thinking of the knife she still kept under her pillow. "A knife won't stop a bullet," he shot back. Their conversations were clipped, strained, a constant dance around the two massive secrets that lay between them, his quest and her lie. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Jack was cleaning his guns on the porch of the main house. Issa watched him from her cabin door. The man was a walking contradiction, a killer with a broken heart, a user with a code of honor. He seemed to sense her watching him and looked up. "He's coming soon," Jack said, not a question. "The man you're looking for, the one they call the Collector." Issa flinched at the name. She'd heard it whispered in the darkness of the pens where they kept the women, a name that promised pain. "His real name is Silas Kane," she heard herself say. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Jack stopped cleaning his pistol. He looked at her, his eyes boring into hers. "You know him." It was a statement. "I've heard the name," she said evasively. Jack stood up and walked slowly towards her, his boots thudding on the wooden planks. He stopped right in front of her. "Don't lie to me, Issa. Not anymore. What do you know about Silas Kane?" She wanted to stay silent, to hold on to the one piece of power she had, but looking into his haunted eyes, she saw the same desperation she felt in her own soul. He was trapped, just like her. He was there," she whispered, the memories flooding back, sharp and cruel. "He would come to the pens, to inspect the merchandise. He's not like the others. He doesn't just want bodies to work or use. He collects them. Pretty things. He has a room, they said, lined with—" She choked on the words. "He liked my friend, the one who died." She couldn't bring herself to say Laura's name. "He visited her. He brought her things. He told her he was going to give her a new life." Jack's face had gone pale, his knuckles white where he gripped the porch railing. "What things?" he rasped. Issa's mind flashed back to Laura, pale and terrified, clutching a small object in her hand after one of Kane's visits. A gift, he'd called it. "A music box," Issa whispered. "Silver, with a bird engraved on the top." Jack stumbled back as if she'd struck him. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. "A lark," he breathed. "My mother gave me and Laura matching music boxes when we were children. Mine played a waltz. Hers played a lullaby. It had a lark engraved on the top." The truth was out. Not all of it, but enough. He knew now. He knew the girl who had died was his sister. He looked from Issa's face to the cabin, where Samuel was sleeping, in the final devastating piece of the puzzle slammed into place for him. His eyes widened, a storm of grief, rage, and disbelief swirling within them. "The baby," he started, his voice cracking. But before he could finish, a sound cut through the rising wind. A single, sharp rifle shot that echoed from the hills. It wasn't a warning. It was an announcement. Silas Kane had arrived. The rifle shot was a death knell. Panic seized Issa. Her first instinct was to grab Samuel and run, to disappear into the rolling hills. But where would she go? Kane's reach was long. Jack was already moving, his face a grim mask of cold fury. The grief from his discovery was instantly channeled into deadly focus. "Get in the house," he yelled at her. Not the main house, but her cabin. "Bar the door and stay away from the window." He grabbed his rifle and a bandolier of ammunition from his porch and sprinted toward the barn, using the failing light as cover. Issa scrambled inside the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She barred the door, her hands shaking. She grabbed Samuel from his cradle, holding him so tight he whimpered in protest. Peeking through a crack in the wall, she saw them. Figures on horseback emerging from the twilight like wraiths. There were more than 4 this time, at least a dozen. They weren't a posse, they were a small army. They surrounded the ranch methodically, silently, cutting off any hope of escape. And at their head, on a tall black horse, sat a man in a fine gray coat. Even from this distance, Issa could feel the sheer menace radiating from him. Silas Kane. The standoff began. Hours crawled by. The storm broke, rain lashing against the small cabin. Every clap of thunder sounded like a gunshot. Issa rocked Samuel, humming the lullaby Laura had taught her, the one from the music box. The melody was a prayer in the suffocating darkness. She didn't know if Jack was alive or dead. The silence from outside was more terrifying than a gunfight would have been. Kane was patient. He was a collector, and he enjoyed the slow, deliberate process of pinning his acquisitions. Sometime before dawn, there was a soft scratching at the cabin door. Issa froze, knife in hand. "Issa!" It was Jack's voice, a low whisper. "It's me. Let me in." She fumbled with the bar and pulled the door open just enough for him to slip inside. He was soaked to the bone, mud-caked and bleeding from a gash on his forehead. But he was alive. "He's waiting for sunrise," Jack breathed, leaning against the door. "He wants to do this in the light. He sent one of his men with a message." "What did it say?" Issa whispered. "It wasn't for me," Jack said, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. "It was for you." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his wet coat. Issa's hands trembled as she took it. It wasn't paper. It was a page torn from a ledger. Her name was written at the top, followed by a price and a stamp. "Property of S. Kane." Below it, Kane had written a message in elegant, looping script. "My dear acquisition, you have something that belongs to me. 2 things, in fact. The boy is a legacy. You are a loose end. Return my property, and I will be merciful. You have until dawn." "He knows," Issa said, the paper crinkling in her fist. "He knows about Samuel." "He knows the boy is Laura's," Jack corrected, his voice heavy with a pain so deep it was almost physical. "He thinks the boy is his." The blood drained from Issa's face. The full, monstrous truth of the situation crashed down on her. Silas Kane hadn't just tormented and killed Laura. He had fathered her child. Samuel was the son of the man who had destroyed their family. This wasn't a rescue mission or a revenge quest anymore. It was a fight for the soul of an innocent child. Jack saw the horror on her face, and his expression hardened. "He will never lay a hand on that boy," he vowed, his voice a low, deadly promise. "He has to get through me first." "He will," Issa cried, tears finally breaking free. "Look at them, Jack. There are too many. We can't win." "We won't win by fighting his way," Jack said, his mind clearly working, piecing together a desperate plan. He looked around the small cabin, then back at her. "You said Kane was a collector, that he liked pretty things. You said he brought Laura gifts." "Yes," Issa said, confused. "What does that matter now?" "It matters," Jack said, a strange, dangerous light entering his eyes. "Because men like that, collectors, they have a weakness. They don't destroy their acquisitions. They retrieve them." He looked at her, then at the sleeping baby in her arms. "He doesn't want you dead, Issa. He wants you back." And that, he said, a grim smile touching his lips, is the only advantage we have. Jack's plan was insane. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble that relied on the twisted psychology of a monster. He explained it in hushed, urgent tones as the first hints of gray lightened the eastern sky. Cain wanted her alive. He wanted the baby unharmed. That meant he wouldn't just storm the cabin with guns blazing. He'd try to flush them out, to corner them. He'd want the satisfaction of the capture. "We have to separate them," Jack whispered, pointing through the crack in the wall. "His men are thugs, but Cain is arrogant. He'll want to be the one to walk in here and claim his prize. We use that." The plan had two parts. The first was fire. Jack had a small stash of kerosene in the barn. If he could get to it, he could create a diversion, setting one of the outbuildings ablaze. In the chaos, as Cain's men split up to deal with the fire, Jack would double back. The second part of the plan was Isa. It was the part that made her stomach turn. "When he comes for you," Jack said, his eyes locking on hers, "you can't fight him. You have to go with him." Isa recoiled. "No, I won't leave Samuel." "You won't," Jack insisted. "You'll have Samuel with you. You'll act broken, defeated. You'll let him lead you out. But you'll lead him right to me." He pointed toward a narrow gap between the barn and the main house. A perfect kill zone. An ambush. "He'll kill you, Jack," she sobbed. "Maybe," Jack conceded. "But it's the only chance we have. The only chance Samuel has. To be free of him." He looked at the baby, his nephew, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the two warring bloodlines in his veins. A deep, paternal love, fierce and protective, radiated from Jack. It was a look that solidified Isa's resolve. She had to trust him. She wiped her tears, her fear hardening into a cold, sharp point. "Okay," she whispered. He gave her a small, tight nod. "I'll go out the back. Give me 10 minutes. No matter what you hear, don't unbar this door until Cain himself is at it." He checked his revolver, slid a long hunting knife into his boot, and gave her one last, long look. A look that said everything he couldn't say. Then he slipped out the back of the cabin and vanished into the pre-dawn gloom. The next 10 minutes were the longest of Isa's life. She listened, her senses stretched to the breaking point. She heard shouts, the whinny of a nervous horse. Then a sudden bright orange glow bloomed against the dark sky, followed by the roar of flames. The old smokehouse was on fire. The diversion had worked. Men were yelling, their attention drawn to the blaze. Isa pressed her eye to the crack in the wall. She saw Cain, still on his horse, barking orders. He sent half his men to fight the fire. The other half held their position, their rifles trained on the cabin. And then Cain dismounted. He walked toward the cabin alone, his fine gray coat billowing behind him like a cape. He was exactly as arrogant as Jack had predicted. He stopped at the door, his bootsteps heavy on the wooden porch. "Isa," he called out, his voice smooth and cultured, a terrifying contrast to his reputation. "The game is over. Open the door." Isa's heart pounded. She clutched Samuel, who was starting to stir. She took a deep breath and drew the bolt. The door creaked open. Silas Cain stood there, a triumphant smile on his lips. His eyes scanned her, then dropped to the baby in her arms. "Excellent," he said, as if admiring a piece of art. "My son. He has his mother's eyes." He stepped inside, his presence filling the tiny cabin, sucking all the air out. "Come," he said, holding out a hand. "It's time to go home." Isa forced herself to look broken. She let her shoulders slump, her eyes fall to the floor. She nodded meekly and allowed him to place a hand on her shoulder, guiding her out onto the porch. Her skin crawled at his touch. She did exactly as Jack had instructed. She stumbled, leading them not toward the main gate, but along the side of the cabin, toward the narrow passage between the buildings. Cain's men were still distracted by the fire. It was just them. "You've been a great deal of trouble," Cain said conversationally, his grip tightening on her arm, "but I do so enjoy a challenge." They reached the opening of the narrow alleyway. This was it. Isa's body tensed. "Now, Jack!" she screamed. From the shadows of the barn, Jack erupted. He wasn't charging with a gun. He was a whirlwind of motion, closing the distance in 3 long strides. Cain, caught completely by surprise, shoved Isa and the baby aside and drew his pistol. But he was too slow. Jack slammed into him like a locomotive. They crashed to the muddy ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. Jack's hunting knife flashed. Kane cried out in pain. The pistol fired, the shot going wild, splintering the wood of the barn wall inches from Isa's head. She scrambled back, shielding Samuel with her body. The fight was brutal, primal. It wasn't a duel, it was a mauling. Kane was bigger, but Jack was fueled by 5 years of rage and grief. He fought like a cornered wolf, all teeth and claws. He drove the knife into Kane's leg, earning another scream. Kane's men, alerted by the gunshot and the screams, were coming. They were running from the fire, rifles raised. They were almost there. Jack was going to be shot to pieces. Suddenly, a new sound split the air, the thundering of hooves. But it wasn't Kane's men. A dozen riders, armed to the teeth, poured over the hill behind the ranch. They wore the dusty star of the Texas Rangers. They surrounded the property in a heartbeat, their rifles leveled. Kane's men skidded to a halt, shocked, dropping their weapons as the Rangers screamed at them to get on the ground. At their lead was an old, grizzled ranger with a scarred face. He dismounted and surveyed the scene. The burning smokehouse, the captured thugs, and the two men locked in a life-or-death struggle in the mud. He leveled his rifle at the fight. "Jack!" he yelled. "Get clear!" Jack rolled away from Kane, breathing heavily, his face bruised and bloody. Silas Kane, clutching his wounded leg, tried to scramble for his dropped pistol. "Don't even think about it, Silas," the ranger growled. "It's over. I've been tracking you since you crossed the border." Kane looked up, his mask of civility finally gone, revealing the snarling beast beneath. He stared at Jack, then at Isa and the baby. "This isn't over, Morale," he spat, venom in his voice. "I'll be back for what's mine." The old ranger just laughed. "No," he said, "you won't." And he pulled the trigger. The world went silent for a moment. The single final crack of the ranger's rifle echoed across the valley, a period at the end of a long, bloody sentence. Silas Kane fell back into the mud and didn't move again. It was over. Truly over. Isa stood frozen, clutching Samuel, watching the smoke curl from the end of the ranger's rifle. Jack pushed himself to his feet, swaying with exhaustion and pain. He and the old ranger looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. "Took you long enough, Eli," Jack rasped. "You're a hard man to follow, Jack," Eli replied, a gruff affection in his voice. "Good to see you're still in one piece." "Mostly." The Rangers were efficient, rounding up Kane's men, dousing the fire, bringing order out of the chaos. Eli walked over to where Jack was leaning against the barn trying to catch his breath. "So this is her," Eli said, nodding towards Isa. "This is Laura's boy." It wasn't a question. Jack just nodded, his gaze fixed on Isa and the child. He took a hesitant step towards them, then another. He stopped a few feet away, his face a wreck of conflicting emotions. Grief for his sister, relief that her son was safe, and a deep, painful uncertainty. He was a stranger to this child, and she, the woman who had lied to him, who had saved him, was the only mother the boy had ever known. Isa met his gaze, her own heart aching. The lies, the fear, the secrets, it all felt like a lifetime ago. All that was left was the quiet aftermath, and the two of them, standing on opposite sides of a chasm of pain. She did the only thing she could think to do. She walked toward him, closing the distance between them. She stopped right in front of him and, with trembling hands, held Samuel out to him. "Meet your nephew, Jack," she whispered. He hesitated for only a second before his arms came up and cradled the baby with a surprising gentleness. He looked down at the small face, at the eyes so like his sister's, and a single tear traced a path through the grime and blood on his cheek. He looked up at Isa, his eyes full of questions he didn't know how to ask. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I was afraid," she answered honestly. "I was afraid you would take him from me. He's all I have." "He's all we have," Jack corrected her softly. And in that moment, the chasm between them disappeared. They weren't a rancher and his bait anymore. They weren't a liar and the man she'd deceived. They were just two broken people, bound together by a tragedy and a small sleeping child. They were, in a strange and shattered way, a family. In the weeks that followed, the Morrell homestead slowly began to heal. The Rangers left, taking Kane's men with them to face justice. Eli left Jack with a firm handshake and a promise to make sure the law recognized Jack as Samuel's legal guardian. The ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the tense, watchful silence of before, but a peaceful one. Jack and Issa fell into a new rhythm, one built on fragile, unspoken truths. They shared the care of Samuel, their hands sometimes brushing as they passed him back and forth. They ate their meals together at the small table in the main house, the silence between them now comfortable instead of heavy. One evening, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Samuel was asleep in his cradle just inside the door. "What will you do now?" Issa asked softly. "I don't know," Jack admitted. "This ranch, I bought it to be a fortress, a place to plan my revenge. I never thought about what would happen after." He looked at her. "What about you? You're free, Issa. You can go anywhere." The thought of leaving sent a surprising pang of sorrow through her. This place, which had been her prison, had also become her sanctuary. This man, who had been her captor, had become her protector. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said quietly, "and I don't want to be alone." Jack nodded slowly. "Me neither." He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the land that stretched before them. "Eli told me about the other places. The other women Kane had locked up. The Rangers freed them, but they have nowhere to go either. Girls like Laura. Girls like you." He turned back to face her, a new idea, a new purpose, dawning in his eyes. "Maybe this place doesn't have to be a fortress anymore," he said. "Maybe it can be something else. A haven." Issa looked at him, at the main house, at the small cabin where she'd first hidden in fear. She thought of all the other women out there, the ones still running, still bleeding, still afraid. She thought of Laura and the promise she had made to her. "Yes," she said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in years. "A place to give them a bed, a place to let them sleep." 2 years later, the Morrell homestead was unrecognizable. The small cabin was now a bunkhouse, clean and warm, with a sign Jack had carved hanging over the door. "Rest here." Another bunkhouse stood beside it. The fields were green and thriving, and the sound of children's laughter often filled the air. It had become a sanctuary, a whisper on the wind for women with nowhere else to turn. They came with bruises and broken spirits, and Issa, now the heart of the homestead, gave them time, space, and a chance to remember who they were before the world tried to tell them they were property. She and Jack had built something from the ashes of their pain. Their partnership had slowly, quietly, blossomed into a deep, abiding love. One autumn afternoon, he found her by the creek, watching Samuel, now a sturdy toddler, chasing butterflies. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have a fancy speech. He just took her hand. "Issa Lorene," he said, using her full name. "I was once a man with nothing but revenge in his heart. Now my heart is full. Marry me. Help me build this life." She didn't have to think about it. She just leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was sold once," she whispered. "This time I choose. Yes, Jack, I'll take your name and build with you." On the last page of a journal she now kept, Issa wrote, "I was once bought for less than a horse. My life was defined by a chain, a price tag, and the cruelty of men. But one man saw a human being, not merchandise. Our love story didn't start with a kiss. It started with mercy. And in the end, that was the only price that ever truly mattered. Out here in the wild, untamed West, not every hero carries a badge. Sometimes they just offer a safe place to land. And sometimes the greatest love stories aren't born from passion, but from the simple, powerful act of seeing another person's soul and vowing to protect it. If this story reminded you that hope can grow in even the hardest soil, then don't ride off into the sunset just yet. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more unforgettable tales of redemption, grit, and the kind of love that saves. Because everyone deserves a place to rest,